Alright, gang, so here is part 2 of episode 4, going through it together to help you learn how to find answers for these. So, when we finished part 1, they thought Alexa was sending them back to Ben's house. Instead, they are in an orange and blue haze. They found 2 pieces of litter now in prehistory, which is very strange. And so a librarian now is about to come up to them, and Ben has made the inference that they must be in Alexa's virtual world. All right? So, we must be in Alexa's virtual world, Ben whispered, just as a ginormous hologram of a fierce-looking librarian in black eyeglasses shot up from the misty ground, tall as a tree. How dare you defy me, Alexa bellowed. When I give you an order, you follow it. Didn't I tell you not to take anything? Listen, if we're going to continue to work together, you must, absolutely must, continue to work together, I whispered to Ben as she continued to fume. Why doesn't she just dump us and find 2 other kids? Maybe because she needs us, Ruby, Ben whispered back, and we both looked at each other as that sank in. So, that's pretty important. So far, Alexa has been the boss. So what happens to the boss when you find out that the boss actually needs you? So have I made myself perfectly clear, she concluded. Ben and I stayed silent for a second or 2, and then I don't know what came over me. Maybe it's just that I can't stand a bully, but I looked her right in her hologram eyes and said, you know, Alexa, if we're going to be working together, if that's what you call forced labor, then what exactly are me and Ben going to get out of the deal? Okay, so we look over at the questions. Remember question 2 over here. How does Ruby's conversation with Alexa during this episode change what happens in the story? Okay, so Ruby is now talking to Alexa, and we're going to figure out how this changes what's going on. So our options are, before we read, A, Alexa agrees to allow Ben and Ruby to keep 2 souvenirs from each mission and to share their story once they finish. B, Ben and Ruby decide to tell everybody at Marshall Middle School that the dog ate their science fair project. C, Alexa says that she is going to require Ben and Ruby to return the Duck Dino stuff they took with them in earlier missions. D, Ben and Ruby look forward to seeing the wild look in Eureka and Arno's eyes when they win the science fair. So, how does Ruby's conversation with Alexa during this episode change what happens? So, good to keep that in mind. What are you going to get out of? Ruby, are you out of your mind? Ben wheezed. You can't really expect us to drop everything we're doing just because you need to know everything there is to know, I said, cool as a cucumber. I'm sorry, Alexa, but Ben and I simply cannot jump through hoops on fire for you without some kind of payback, so I'm afraid we're going to have to say no. Oh yeah? Alexa snarled. In a blast of blue and orange light, we were suddenly in the Colosseum in ancient Rome, and 3 lions were racing toward us. Change your mind yet? Alexa asked snottily. I hardly think so, I answered, despite Ben pleading with me to shut up. Then what about this? Alexa shot back, and there we were at the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War, with 2 armies charging at each other, rifles in hand, and me and Ben right in the middle of the battlefield. Okay. So they are now at the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War. And if we go back over to the questions, remember we have one that says, here we go, question number 8 is to look at the events below and which happen after they're transported to the middle of the Civil War battle. So we already know it's not going to be B because they already were sent to the Colosseum. So they were sent to the Colosseum first and then the Battle of Gettysburg. So we know it's not going to be that one. Alexa transported Ben and Ruby to her virtual world and scolded them for defying her orders. All right, that already happened too, so that's not going to happen afterwards. So it's either going to be A or B. Ruby demanded that she and Ben be given the privilege of publicly sharing all of their time-traveling experience, as well as claiming souvenirs. Or D, Ben realized that Alexa needed his and Ruby's assistance in order to gather all the knowledge she required. Actually, D, we look up, and Ben did realize that already. So, right up here, after they're yelling, Ben whispers, "Maybe she needs us, Ruby." So that's really going to help you narrow down the answers to question 8, all right? Because only one of them is going to have to happen afterwards. Okay, so. "Come on, Alexa, is that the best you can do?" I yawned. And with that, we were back in her blue and orange virtual cloud. "So, what do you want?" she asked, the sound of defeat in her drone. "When all this is done," I said, Ben and I want to tell our story to the world, about what you and the Haskell whatever and everything else we do from you from this moment on. And we want to keep 2 souvenirs from each mission." "Grr, deal," she said quietly, "but only when we're done." Okay, so that's the end of that conversation. So look back up to question 2. How does this conversation change what happens in the story? Okay, so look through, and we now know the result of this conversation. We know what Alexa agreed to and what Ruby asked for. So go ahead and put down that answer when you find it. Okay. "Understood," I said triumphantly, pulling out some dinosaur eggshells and teeth from my pocket. "And we'll start with these 2 souvenirs right here." Grrr. And one other thing," Ben said. "We found a plastic water bottle and a candy wrapper in prehistory, and we want to know how they got there." "I, don't know how, I, haven't the foggiest. But that's enough questions for one day. Tomorrow, right after school, be prepared for your next mission," she snapped and vanished. And Ben and I rematerialized in his room. "She knows more than she's saying," Ben said quietly. And then we looked at each other with the exact same question in mind. Where was she going to send us next? So that's the end of episode 4. Go to the questions here. So, what is this episode mainly about? So, many of these answers might have true information, but we have to figure out like the main overarching. So, is this episode mainly about A? Instead of returning to the present day in Ben's room like they did previously, Ruby and Ben find themselves in a strange blue and orangey cloud. Okay, so that happened for a paragraph. That is true information, but is it like the main gist of this episode? Okay, let's look at B. Ruby and Ben travel to many different time periods, including the Colosseum in ancient Rome and the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, they did do that. Not so much traveling as being sent there, because Alexa's trying to intimidate them. So that did happen. C. Alexa tries to scare Ruby and Ben into cooperating, but ultimately agrees to what they want since they are helping her. Okay, so that's information that goes over, quite a few paragraphs. So that's a good contender because we scroll toward the beginning of this episode, and that's when Alexa is trying to threaten them. And then when they're not sure if they want to follow her, she then sends them to different places to try and threaten them. And then after all that, they're still not scared. And Alexa does ultimately agree to do what they want. So that's a good contender. So D, Ruby complains that Alexa expects them to drop everything they are doing just because Alexa needs to know everything there is to know. All right, so again, that happened. That was like part of the dialogue. That happened in a small spot. So to me, there's clearly one answer that's best for like what is the episode as a whole mainly about. So go ahead. And so we now went through 1, 2, we went through 3. Okay, so we haven't done 4 yet. So what is one inference the reader can make from this episode? So remember, an inference is an educated guess based on evidence. So one educated guess we can make based on what we read. A. Ruby is anxious for the fame that would come with being able to prove to the world that she has been time traveling. B. Ben and Ruby are eager to experience historical events through time travel to deepen their understanding of history. Alexa must continue to work with Ben and Ruby because there's no one else capable of time traveling. D. Ruby is terrified about the possibility that Alexa might send them somewhere even more dangerous than prehistory. So, remember, it has to fit what we read, and what's a pretty good guess you could make. Okay. And let's see, the other one we have not done yet. Okay, there's a couple more. So, look at this passage from the episode. Why did the author include this information? So, here's what he took from the story for this question. So it says, "Oh yeah," Alexa snarled, and in a blast of blue and orange light, we were suddenly in the Colosseum in ancient Rome, where 3 lions were racing toward us. So she's trying to intimidate him. "Change your mind yet?" Alexa said snottily. "I hardly think so," I answered, despite Ben pleading with me to shut up. "Then what about this?" Alexa shot back, and there we were at the Battle of Gettysburg, during the Civil War, with 2 armies charging at each other, rifles in hand, and me and Ben in the middle of a battlefield. Yikes. But Ruby still says, "Come on, Alexa, is that the best you can do?" I yawned, and with that, we were back in the blue and orange virtual cloud. So why might the author include that paragraph? Like, what do we get out of it as readers? So, A, to demonstrate that Alexa has plans to send Ben and Ruby to many other places and time periods. That's not really what Alexa was going for. Like, she was trying to show them, like, she was powerful right there. So, B, to emphasize Ruby's independent spirit and her determination to gain some control over an unexpected situation. C, to provide the reader with historical context for the continued time-traveling expeditions of Ben and Ruby. So, if he's really trying to give us history there. Or D, to showcase Alexa's complete control over Ben and Ruby and their helplessness to face her immense power. So, this was not an attempt for the author to educate us in history. So it's not C, because that's not what the paragraph's about. And it is not to show us that they're going to go to many time periods. So it's either going to be B or D. Either this paragraph was put in to show us that Ruby is determined to gain some control over this situation, or it's to show us that Alexa has complete control and Ben and Ruby are helpless. So by the end of this episode, what did we get out of this situation? That Ruby is determined and she's gaining some control? Or that these 2 are helpless and have no control? Think about it, and that'll help you. And the last one we have not done is, based on this episode, which of these is true? So, Mr. Ensign, Ruby and Ben's science teacher. So Mr. Ensign yelled at them for losing stuff. B, Ruby and Ben saw someone drinking water from a water bottle and eating a Snickers bar and dropping the wrapper. C, Eureka and Arno came in first place in the science fair after Ben and Ruby had to create a last-minute project. D, Ben and Ruby secretly took some dinosaur eggshells and teeth when they were in prehistory and put them in her pocket. So, based just on this episode, which one is true? Okay. And so that you're just finding literal information. You're going to go back through these first few paragraphs, and it's going to literally tell you which one of those things is true. So I hope this helps. It gives you a big grade boost, and I will definitely put up more if it does. All right. So thank you for your patience. I know it's not exciting, but I appreciate you. Let's get good grades.